Jennifer, so we've got a stalemate here. I've asked you this question before in terms of international, but what about internally? Is there any move where we could see some sort of backing off of the positions? Is there any, for example, opposition within the ruling party to what Maduro is doing and opposition within the opposition that could lead to some sort of transitional power-sharing government or something like that? I know this has been mentioned before. What do you feel the climate is like for that?
There is certainly the possibility for that. We just saw yesterday, in fact, two of the deputies, the representatives in the legislature who were in the governing party, leaving the governing party to form their own separate bloc. And that if we see more of that sort of defection or splitting within the government side, then that provides a little opening, provides a third sector, and helps to break down the polarization. As well, those within the opposition who are willing to negotiate and to compromise, which takes courage, because a lot of people want, all-out victory and punishment against those who they see as their enemies. That's what it's going to take, people with courage to do that and beginning to move and split up the two blocks and break down the polarization. But it's very difficult now, and to compare this time with the 2002 era, the government has all the cards in terms of power. The opposition really has no power except people in terms of the number of the large public opinion that opposes the government. But otherwise, it doesn't really have much leverage. And that's a very different situation than in 2002, when it was more equally divided in different ways, and we were able to bring them together to talk.
Mark, do you think that that's the case, that there is some sort of hope? Also, given the worsening economic situation, this can't go on forever, correct?
That's right. I do think there is hope. I think that both sides do have an incentive to negotiate, because they can't, neither one is going to win. Neither one's going to get power. I don't think the regime change strategy is a disaster, even if they were able to topple the government. I mean, and this is where I think the U.S. role is really devastating, and you saw what happened in Iraq and Syria and Libya and Afghanistan. That's the kind of thing. I mean, Central America had very, terrible wars in the 1980s, and those were fueled also by U.S. intervention. So I think it's very, very important. This is still a polarized country. Michael says, okay, he's at a 20% approval rating. That's right, that's low. But Temer next door in Brazil, the president, has 5%. Okay?
Yes, I saw that today.
And not just, you have millions of people who have a legitimate fear. Like Jennifer said, you got to have guarantees so that this can be resolved peacefully and electorally. You have to have guarantees that the losing side is not going to be persecuted by all three branches of government. And you did have a coup in 2002, and you did have an immediate actual dictatorship established with the abolition of the National Assembly, the Supreme Court, and the Constitution, and people were rounded up, government officials were rounded up, and dozens of people were killed within the first 36 hours.
Okay.
And that's the thing that people a lot of people are afraid of. Millions of people have to fear that because they're associated with the government in some way. So you really have to have a negotiated solution.
Michael, you disagree with that?
Well, I disagree. No one has mentioned the fact that there is a legitimate National Assembly that was that's controlled by the opposition, that was voted in December of 2015.
Yes, and
if I were the opposition, I would have boycotted this Constituente as well, because
which they did.
Which they did, and I support their decision. It's completely justified. This new Constituente that was invoked in the name of unifying Venezuela, which will have exactly the opposite effect. It makes things worse, not better, has the power to supplant, to replace the legitimate elected National Assembly controlled by the opposition. So this is a instrument and a tactic that's used by autocratic regimes, and they're completely in their right to protest this. This is an outrageous move by the Maduro government. It is a blatant power grab. I don't agree with the opposition on a lot of issues, but on this one, I think they have a strong case.
I just want to follow up with you because we've had some other voice, and I just want to follow up. There is, though, this historical feeling that some parts of the opposition have basically very much represent going backwards to an era where economic power was in the hands of a few, that they were sometimes seen as pawns of Washington, and that is also the fear.
Well, that's why we have something called elections, because opposition has there are differences within the opposition. You're right, there are different currents. No one denies that, but there are elections that are mandated by the Chavista Constitution, the Constitution of Hugo Chavez that he used to distribute as if they were the Bible, and it's being circumvented, that Constitution, and so the people are saying, well, let's respect the Constitution, let's have a vote, and precisely those kind of differences of ideas, whether to go back, whether to go forward, and how to do so, will be discussed openly.
You raise a good point. George Ciccariello-Maher, what sort of constitution are we going to see replace the old one from this new assembly? I mean, the critics outside of the country have said it will basically give Maduro more power, be able to make sure that he could postpone presidential elections, put all the economic levers of power directly within the government. Is that what we're going to see?
Well, I mean, people like to project, their paranoias before anything is actually put down on paper, and so we should be very careful about this. Any constitutional reform, which I actually think it will only be a minor reform, because the 1999 Constitution is a very good constitution. Any reform would have to go to the people, would have to be approved by the people. Michael said that this was a tool of autocrats, but it was also the same. A constituent process is always a process that breaks with a previous institutional order, as Chavismo did in 1999, and we're looking at a process that could reform this constitution, would be put up for a vote, and then would see new elections. Of course, would see presidential elections, would see legislative elections in the future. And again, this is what's going to happen. And whether Chavismo can win those elections is a real big question, depending on how it deals with these pressing economic questions, and whether or not there's this possibility of breaking out of the political stalemate that exists today. And the Constituent Assembly is one strategy. It's not a perfect strategy by any means, but there are very few other strategies on the table.
Thanks for that. Let's go to Jennifer. Let's talk about the economy a little bit, because these numbers are just staggering. $140 billion in debt. The foreign currency has plummeted. It was 10 bolivars to the dollar. Now on the black market, it's 8,000. Inflation of 600% last year, probably going to be even more. 87%, as we said in the introduction, of people basically can't afford food. Exoduses from the country. Is that economic situation, I mean, just how dire is it on the streets of Caracas and elsewhere? And will that lead to some sort of break politically, do you think?
Well, it's really urgent to address the economic situation, because it's affecting, not just people's pocketbooks, but their health, and the shortages of medicine and the malnutrition for children that we've seen photos of, but the breakdown in the public health system. So it really is dire, I think, to start addressing the economic situation, because the further down the hole this country goes, the longer it's going to take to recover and restabilize the economy. So I would actually favor the idea of an negotiated interim government with representation and acceptable to both sides, to focus on the economy and on reestablishing the institutions, the independence of the institutions, and then to hold elections and let the politicians focus on campaigning. Because I know from experience in Venezuela and in other countries in mediation does not happen, talks do not happen during an electoral campaign. Neither side wants to be seen as talking to the other. And so if an interim government that will not stay in power, will not run for election, can focus on the economy and get that going, and then let the politicians begin to think about campaigns down the road, that's what I think would be the desirable outcome.
Mark, obviously the economic situation is bad, and there are hints here in Washington that we could see oil sanctions. Now, it's complicated because Venezuela is one of the biggest providers of heavy crude to the US. There's lots of refineries dedicated to doing that. But if that happened, what do you think the impact would be on not just Maduro, but the people of Venezuela who are already suffering?
Well, it's pretty much agreed by everyone that it would be devastating. and the situation would get much worse. There'd be much more hunger and shortage of medicines. But I want to reinforce also what Jennifer said, that you really do need change in economic policy. I was part of a team from the Union of South American Nations, a team of economists that went there several times last year and met with the government and presented a plan for some of these changes. And I think that the most important one, of course, is the exchange rate. They have a dysfunctional exchange rate system where most of the foreign exchange earnings of the government are given away for almost nothing. And then you have this spiral, inflation depreciation spiral, where the inflation keeps rising and the currency on the black market keeps depreciating. So that's what has to be resolved. But the problem is that the threat of sanctions, even just the threat, and the sanctions against individuals really worsens that situation, because it prevents the government from getting foreign exchange, from getting foreign investment. So right now, the U.S. government is dedicated to worsening the situation they have right now. The threat of sanctions is very powerful. If you're even a small saver with money, you're going to want to take it out of the country and put it in dollars.
And there's a huge exodus of that money as well. Michael, last word. Do you think U.S. sanctions are appropriate here going forward? And also, what do you think the regional impact is going to be? Obviously, you know, Venezuela has helped subsidize countries like Cuba, helped with aid relief in Haiti. There is a real regional aspect to this as well.
There sure is, and I think if we want to talk about negotiated solutions, which I'm totally in favor of, and trying to get out of this profound crisis, we should really talk about the regional governments, and not only the governments that have been critical of Venezuela, but some of the governments mentioned at the outset, including Cuba. Listen, no one wants the worst case scenario in Venezuela. You want stability and want to get out of this mess, and everybody recognizes there are profound problems. And so I think that's the kind of process that needs to be pursued. I am not, a great advocate of sanctions. I certainly agree with Mark on this one. We agree that economic sanctions or not buying oil would have a devastating impact on Venezuelans who are already suffering and would be very, very misguided. Individual sanctions, again, I don't think have much impact either way. So I think the focus has to be on how to get out of this crisis with a negotiated solution. And I think we should look at there is a sort of a geopolitical chessboard that Venezuela is on, and I think we have to figure out how to move the pieces to move in that direction.
It would be amazing if the US, Russia, China, regional could actually come together and help out. It's incredible that the country with the highest oil reserves in the world also has the highest murder rate, and just terrible situation. Thanks so much for everyone for joining us. A really stimulating discussion. That's it. We have no more time for this edition of The Heat.